challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is now time for, yes, the Thursday evening edition of the Gaggle live stream. Welcome, everybody who's joined me. Really happy and honored that you're with me. And there's a few topics that I want to get to. If you recall, when we did our live stream, when we did our podcast with Peter yesterday, we discussed President Putin's trip to the Far East, and we mostly addressed the that is the issue of Putin's warnings to the West about any seizures of Russian cargo ships or Russian tankers, and that's what our podcast was mostly focused on. You know, the warnings and that basically that. The Western powers had assumed that Russia would just simply blandly accept in perpetuity the seizures of its ships and wouldn't retaliate. And we said, well, Russia will, of course, retaliate. Now, you know, what's really happened since then, so over the past 24 hours, has kind of given the story a slightly different hue, because instead of the media instead of focusing on Putin's warnings to the West, you know, if you seize our ships, we will seize yours. Instead of focusing on that, the media have played up the question of Putin's visit to the Kuriles Islands, and that somehow this was a violation of some agreements. This was an invasion of the sovereignty of Japan, and that somehow, you know, Putin was throwing down the gauntlet to Japan. And so the story is now no longer about this threat to Western ships, but basically, which was, as we described it yesterday, you seize our ships, we'll seize yours. But now it's that Putin has openly insulted the Japanese by making the visit to the Kuriles Islands. Now, this, of course, does raise rather interesting issues, because if you go back into history, the Kuriles Islands, and that's very strategically located. In fact, let's take a look at the map of these of the well. Before we look at that, I just want to highlight what it was that Putin said apropos of relations with Japan. So in a way, he anticipated yesterday. Of course, he got onto the main topic of the conversation, which was the seizure of Western ships. But before that, he did address the question of relations with Japan, because relations with Japan had been deteriorating for some time. I mean, obviously since February 2022, but they had been deteriorating before that. And as a result of that deterioration, all kinds of negotiations, and particularly on the issue of the Kuriles Islands, which we'll talk about now in some detail, but particularly the issue that remains standing, which was the lack of a peace treaty between Japan. What it was originally, there was no peace treaty between Japan and the Soviet Union, and that's continued. That there's still no treaty between Japan and Russia. So the war came to an end now 81 years ago, and there's still no peace treaty. So, so Putin addressed that and said about how these relations between Russia and Japan, which had been quite promising during the Shinzo Abe era, had gradually taken a downward turn. And let's just take a look at what he said about relations with Japan. So here's the comments, and here it says, it has already been stated that the situation in the Asia Pacific region is complex and there are plenty of problems. I would simply say that we would also like to understand the position of Japan, our neighbor, which was mentioned in the presentations here, under the pretext of events in Ukraine. Without delving into the causes of the conflict, Japan imposed sanctions against Russia without provoking us. Moreover, for the first time in its latest military doctrine documents, Japan has listed Russia among the sources of its primary threats. I would like to point out that we are not threatening Japan. We have absolutely no claims against it. On the contrary, Japan has territorial claims against our country. I am referring to the Kuriles Islands issue. However, this is enshrined in international documents as a reality that arose following World War II. But even here, Russia was prepared to seek a solution through a peace treaty with Japan. Let me remind you that back in the mid-1950s, the USSR signed a declaration with Japan that paved the way for a peace treaty. Japan also signed it, but later withdrew. Then the Soviet Union did the same, but the new Russia responded to the Japanese government's request and resumed, I repeat, as the Japanese side's request, dialogue to find paths to a peace treaty. Moreover, it was initially agreed that the work would also proceed on the basis of the declarations I just mentioned, and then he goes on about the maritime issue. Now, roughly speaking, if one looks back at the Kuriles Islands, it's quite a complicated history, but the contemporary issue, which the Japanese go on and on and on about, goes back to the wartime decisions that culminated in the agreement signed at Yalta. So, as if you'll recall, the United States and the United Kingdom, but particularly the United States, were very eager to get the Soviet Union involved in the war against Japan. So the Soviet Union and Japan had signed in 1941 a neutrality treaty. So there'd been a war. Japan had invaded the Soviet Union during the 1930s. There'd been a war between Japan and the Soviet Union, quite a brutal war, which went on for several years. Finally, the Soviet Union defeated Japan in 1939, the Gulkin Goal, and then in 1941 they signed a neutrality treaty or a non-aggression treaty, or however you want to call it. So between 1941 and 1945, there was no fighting between Japan and the Soviet Union, but Roosevelt was very keen to get Stalin to get involved in the war. Stalin held back. He said, "Well, I got to deal with the Wehrmacht first. That's our main problem, and then once we've dealt with the Wehrmacht, then we can focus our attention to Japan." And that is, in fact, what happened. Now, at Yalta, in February 1945, the United States made a number of commitments to the Soviet Union in order to get the Soviet Union to join the war against Japan. And one of the commitments that the United States made was that the Kuriles Islands, which is these very strategically located islands between Japan and the Soviet Union, the Kuril Islands will revert to the ownership of the Soviet Union. And that would, of course, apply also to southern Sakhalin. And all of this relates to, um, the the wars that had taken place, particularly the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, when which Japan got the better of Russia in that war. Japan. It's always exaggerated some of the Japan defeated Russia, or whatever, but Japan got the better of Russia, and as part of this agreement, the Japanese ownership of the Kuril Islands was agreed upon, and southern Sakhalin was then also went into the possession of Japan. So there was a treaty, the St. Petersburg Treaty of 1875, that already established the ownership of the Kuril Islands by Japan. But Sakhalin, the island of Sakhalin, also strategically located, the island of Sakhalin became the property of Russia. But then, as a result of the 1905 war between Japan and Russia, which, as I say, Japan got the better of that, Japan took over the southern part of Sakhalin. So now, in order to get Stalin to declare war against Japan, and in effect to break the neutrality treaty between Japan and the Soviet Union, in order to get Stalin to do that, Roosevelt offered him the incentives, which were the Kuril Islands reverts to Russia, southern Sakhalin reverts to Russia, and Port Arthur, a very strategically located port in China, it's called now Darien at the time, becomes of the property of the USSR, and that was the deal. And that that is how the Kuril Islands became the property of the Soviet Union. As I say, they are strategically located. Now, what then happens, this becomes very interesting, is that at the Treaty of San Francisco, which was in effect the peace treaty between the United States and its allied powers and Japan. Essentially, Japan rescinded its claims upon the Kuril Islands. We'll take a look at that document in a moment. But basically, Japan, just said, we withdraw all claims on the Kuril Islands and on Sakhalin. So that's basically the basis. That's the fundamental basis of Russia's claim to the Kuril Islands. So basically, the northern Kuril Islands, though no one, the Japanese aren't claiming that, but the southern Kuril Islands, the ones that are closer to Japan, those are also now in the possession of Russia. And since Japan had actually said we rescind all our claims on the Kuril Islands, then you have to ask, well, then what is the basis of Japan's claim? I mean, you said you agreed at the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951. You agreed that you no longer have any claims on the Kuril Islands. And so what Japan has done is to claim that these 4 islands that, which are Etorofu, Kurashiri, Habumae, and Shiktan, these 4 islands are not really part of the Kuriles. They are actually part of Japan. They don't belong to the Kuril Islands. Well, that's an interesting claim. And the United States, and you would think the United States is Japan's chief patron in the world, the United States hasn't exactly agreed with Japan's claims. It's agreed partially. Basically, the Habomai and Shikotan, it says we don't think that they are part of the Kuril Islands. But on the other hand, Etorofu and Kunashiri are part of the Kuril Islands. Now, Putin yesterday went to Etorofu. So as far as the United States is concerned, that island, the Etorofu Island, is a part of the Kuriles, and therefore it's part of the islands that Japan has actually withdrawn any claims upon. But interestingly, and a kind of a twist to the story is that in 1956, and Putin was alluded to that. I mean, the Russians unfortunately don't make good presentations. They don't make good arguments about their various historic claims. So he just kind of rushed this through, assuming everybody knows this history. But of course they don't, and a lot of people just look at this and don't quite know what he's talking about. Basically, Putin said that in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev and the Japanese leaders of the time signed a joint declaration. And in the joint declaration, Russia said that Habomai and Shikotan, two of the four islands, would be released and returned to Japan, but only subsequent to the signing of a peace treaty. In other words, a peace treaty would come first, and then Habomai and Shikotan, the very two islands that the United States actually does say agrees with Japan that they're not a part of the Kuril island chain, they would be returned. Now, Russia never accepted the point that Habomai and Shikotan are not a part of the Kuriles, which is what Japan is claiming. So Russia doesn't agree with that position. But it said, as a gesture of goodwill, following the signing of a peace treaty, then we will return Habomai and Shikotan. Well, there was no peace treaty, and Japan continued to demand all of the islands back. And so nothing really very much happened there. And there have been various spasmodic negotiations over the years between Japan and Russia, Japan and the Soviet Union, and Japan and Russia, but it's never got very far. Now, the point about this, to discuss this history, is that a number of people, including, of course, leaders of Ukraine and leaders of Latvia, have jumped in and started yelling that, oh, this is outrageous. Putin's visit is, to Etorofu is an outrage. This is island; it belongs to Japan, and Russia has no business being on that island. Now, of course, the important point is that was agreed upon. These are part of the wartime agreements. If you're going to start disputing wartime agreements, then you're going to have to start disputing an awful lot of the wartime agreements that were signed and basically determined the borders of Europe. So, such as, of course, the borders of Germany and Poland, such as the borders of Poland and Ukraine, and so on. So you can't just start picking and choosing. We don't like this wartime agreement. Those were the agreements that now determine the boundaries of states. So if you look at the map, you can see how strategically strategically vital the Kuril Islands. Is a little, here we see it. You can see here it's right. There's Russia at the top, and then here's Japan. And so the islands that we're talking about, they're close to Japan. No question, they are close to Japan. Shikotan, Habomai, Kunashir, and Eturofu. This is Eturofu. It's in the Russian form, which is Iturop. Okay, so you can see they're close to Japan, but nonetheless, those are all of them basically Russians say that those are all part of the Kuril island chain, and those were promised to us in the Yalta agreements, and they're obviously, as you can see, they are all strategically important. So if you're concerned with your security, you're not going to allow any other power, particularly any hostile power, to occupy these islands. And as long as Japan is very closely integrated with the United States, closely integrated with NATO, then Russia says, hey, we just don't trust you. If we were to return these islands to you, in no time at all, we'd have NATO building bases there. Bases, surveillance installations. You would have all kinds of electronic warfare facilities built on those islands. There's no way we're going to return this. And for Japan to keep demanding this while they're maintaining this hostile foreign policy towards Russia, it's just stupidity. The kind of stupidity Japan has shown often in the past. So that was basically it. But nonetheless, that didn't stop Japan from screaming today in outrage over the Putin visit to Etorofu, as if anyone in the world accepts that Etorofu belongs to Japan, other than of course these NATO flags. But basically, there's no international law or anything that supports Japan's claims to it. Anyway, so this is the map. And then here is the tweet that was sent out by the Japanese Prime Minister. She says, today, the 13th, I received a report that Russian President Putin visited Iturup Island. And just now, I held an informal press conference at the official residence, since President Putin stated in January 2024 that he would definitely visit the Northern Territories. That's what the Japanese refer to these four islands, the Northern Territories. The Russians say that these are the part of the Kuril Islands. The Northern Territories, the Japanese government has repeatedly requested the Russian side to ensure that the president does not visit the Northern Territory, where Japan has no say in what Russia does or doesn't do. Russia does not come under the jurisdiction of Japan, and relations between Russia and Japan are not exactly warm, whereby Japan can make all sorts of demands on what the Russian side does or doesn't do. But anyway, nevertheless, I strongly protest today's visit to Iturup Island by President Putin. The Northern Territories are inherently Japanese territory, both historically and under international law. Well, you can argue that it's historically, though that's, of course, up for debate, but certainly not under international law. There is no basis whatsoever. Japan has no claim whatever under international law to these four islands, because no one accepts them as belonging to Japan. These were the wartime agreements, and as we'll see, and this is very important, in the Treaty of San Francisco that ended the war between Japan and the United States and Allied powers. That was in 1951. Japan withdrew its claims on the Kuril Islands. So if it wants to claim that it's not a part of the Kuril Islands, then you'd have to whip out its history books and make this claim. But as I said, and we'll take a look at that in a moment, the United States does not agree with Japan's claim or at least not wholly agrees with Japan's claim that these four islands are not part of the Kuril island chain. And so we have this issue, go drones on in protest. Moreover, it wounds the feelings of the Japanese people and is absolutely unacceptable. Well, I'm sorry, but wounding the feelings of the Japanese people, because it doesn't really matter, because hey, Japan started a war, Japan lost a war. I mean, that's what happens. Japan started a war, Japan lost a war, Japan lost territory. That's what happens when you lose a war. Germany lost a lot of territory, started a war, lost a war, lost a lot of territory. Hungary didn't even start the war of 1914. It got caught up in that war, lost a lot of territory, lost two-thirds of its territory. So if you end up on the wrong side of a war, you're going to lose territory. So for going on and on in this ridiculous way, the wounded feelings of the Japanese people. Well, too bad. Don't start wars and then don't lose wars. But that's what happened. And in the case of Japan and Russia, Russia has a lot of grievances against Japan. I mean, there was the attack. It was on Port Arthur in 1904. It was, much like Pearl Harbor. It was, an act of infamy. Japan did not declare war. Japan just simply launched this attack on Port Arthur. And as I say, Japan got the better of that war, and boy, did it make Russia pay as a result. As I say, they took southern Sakhalin, they took pieces of Manchuria, they took Korea. The Japanese drove a hard bargain following the 1904-05 war with Russia. So no one's terribly impressed with Japanese whining today. And anyway, then she goes on about the wounding the feelings of, even amid the harsh state of Japan-Russia relation following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Japan has made every possible effort, but this visit can only be said to have further hardened anti-Russia sentiment within Japan and made medium to long-term recovery of relations more difficult. I hope that the Russian side will take the gravity of this matter very seriously. Well, I don't think so, because I think the Russian side will say Japan could have taken a moderate, reasonable, fairly neutral position. It could have tried to do a Viktor Orban, not taking anyone's side, or yeah, more like India. We're not on anybody's side. We just want this war to come to an end. Instead, Japan has thrown in its lot with the United States and NATO. Well, given the hostility that Japan has displayed towards Russia, how the hell could you possibly imagine that Russia will see these Kuril Islands? We saw them. Those are strategic islands. I mean, there's no way is Russia going to have allowed Japan to take those islands and allow the United States to build all its military electronic espionage facilities on those islands. Anyway, we'll go on a little bit. And and then here we have the New York Times. Putin visits islands seized from Japan in World War II, angering Tokyo. Now, a lot of media phrased it in this way, that these islands were seized from Japan in World War II. They were not seized. They were agreed upon during the wartime conferences. These were the wartime conferences, and that was international law what the three Allied powers decided. This was the price for the Soviet Union entering the war against Japan. This was the islands, the Kuril Islands. So here she goes. Prime Minister Takaichi of Japan has been a public critic of Mr. Putin, who has denounced her country's sanctions against Russia over the Ukraine war. And then Mr. Putin used the visit to reassert Russia's territorial claims and to protest Japan's ongoing sanctions against Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. A day before the visit, he said that Russia's claim to the islands was a reality that had been enshrined in international documents. All right, and it says Japan has territorial claims against us. And then it says Japan traced its claims to the 17th century, but the Russians generally date their sovereignty to the waning days of World War II, when Soviet troops occupied the islands after Japan's surrender in 1945. Japan and Russia. Well, notice how again they say, "Oh, the Soviet occupation," but again they don't mention that the Soviet occupation took place as a result of the agreement that was signed at Yalta. It was an agreement. We'll take a look at it in a minute. It's publicly available. The document that was agreed upon at Yalta, the conditions under which the Soviet Union enters the war against Japan. So here, signed, the disputed lands are part of an archipelago stretching from the southern tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula in eastern Russia to Hokkaido, the northern part of Japan. Mr. Putin visited an island that is called Iturup in Russia. Oh, that's the one we called as Etorofu. And he toured fish processing complex and ate caviar. He also visited a hospital and school. And then here, same thing in the Washington Post. Putin angers Japan with visits to islands seized by the Soviet Union. And both Moscow and Tokyo view the four southernmost islands in the chain as their rightful territory, with Russia calling them the Southern Kuril Islands and Japan calling them the Northern Territories. And then this is, we have the Japanese Prime Minister statement. And then we have the Guardian, absolutely unacceptable. Japan condemns visit by Putin, and so on and so forth. And here we have Japan's foreign minister, Toshimitsu Motegi, summoned the Russian ambassador Nikolai Nozdrev, while the prime minister called Putin's actions absolutely unacceptable, and so on. Then he says the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945 as Tokyo was about to surrender, and the dispute has prevented the two nations from signing a formal peace treaty. Well, not really, because one of the reasons why Roosevelt was prepared to pay such a heavy price to get the Soviet Union to enter the war against Japan is that the United States was by no means sure of victory over Japan. I mean, in retrospect, of course, Japan was on the brink of surrender, but that's very much up in the air whether Japan was on the brink of surrender. I mean, the conventional view, particularly in the United States, is that Japan surrendered following the dropping of the two atomic bombs. That is, to say the least, debatable, because while the atom bombs caused enormous damage, killed an awful lot of people, that wouldn't necessarily have forced Japan's leaders to surrender. I mean, Japan was pretty much defenseless by August 1945. and the firebombing of Tokyo, the firebombing of one city after another, hadn't moved Japan's leaders to surrender. It was just, these are total devastation the United States was inflicting on Japan. Masses and masses of people were getting killed through U.S. bombing, and Japan's leaders had not surrendered. So there's no particular reason why the dropping of two atom bombs would necessarily have forced the surrender. What was decisive was indeed the entry of the Soviet Union into the war and the total destruction of the Kwantung Army following the Soviet Union's entry into the war. That um, had forced the Japanese to sue for peace. So that's really the Western media, including the Guardian, of course. Oh, the Soviet Union, they got in the last few days, and the war was already over. No, the war wasn't already over. The Japanese did not surrender following the dropping of the two atomic bombs. It was the Soviet Union's entry into the war that proved to be decisive. Now, here we have the familiar stories, and then we have the Japan Times. So as Putin visits the disputed Etorofu island of Hokkaido, it's off Hokkaido, to emphasize that somehow it belongs to Japan and is not part of the Kuril Islands chain. And the Russian leader visited, landed the northernmost of the four disputed islands known as Japan, and the visit comes at a time of year when Japan and the world look back on the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Saturday's anniversary of the end of World War II, and the subsequent Soviet Union invasion of the northern islands. So not an invasion, it was a part of the wartime agreements. And speaking to reporters, Prime Minister Sanai strongly protested, the Northern Territories are historically and legally an inherent part of our country's territory. What's legally? I mean, she keeps saying this, that this is legally, according to legally, how is it under Japanese territory? It's not legally, there's nothing in international law that says this is Japanese territory. This visit to Etorofu by the sitting president of Russia is incompatible with Japan's consistent position on the Northern Territory. Well, it probably is. Who the hell cares what Japan's position on the Northern Territories is? This is Putin's first visit, and then of course Medvedev had visited the Kunashiri, another one of the four islands, in 2010. It also comes just 2 weeks after Takaichi met on July the 30th with a group of high school students whose grandparents and great-grandparents are former island residents. And then she's, so on. And then she talks about the ancestral graves. And on Wednesday, while in Sakhalin, Putin rejected Japan's attempts to negotiate for the return of the four islands, saying that Russia's occupation was a reality of World War II, confirmed in international documents, though he did not cite specific agreements. Well, okay, let me cite them for you. Let me cite those agreements, since the Japan Times seems to suggest by that statement, whoa, there are no agreements. Well, let me cite. The agreement is the Yalta Agreement, and the Yalta agreements are binding. I mean, there's nothing in the Yalta agreements shaped the entire post-1945 world, which we're still living in. So the Yalta agreements are binding. That's one binding agreement. Binding agreement number 2 is the Treaty of San Francisco. 2 agreements. So maybe the Japan Times ought to take a look at the historical documents. They're all available online. And then, anyway, let's continue. So, and then Japan's position is that it had discovered and surveyed the four islands before Russia arrived and had established effective control over them by the end of the 19th century, and that the 1855 treaty between Japan and Russia confirmed inherent boundaries between Etorofu and the Russian island of Urupu. Well, that's very nice, and that's no doubt is true about the 1855 agreement, but the 1855 agreement was violated by Japan's aggression in 1905, and then there was a new agreement, rather the aggression of 1904, and in 1905 there was a new agreement in which Japan took over southern Sakhalin. So up until then, Japan had accepted that Sakhalin belongs to Russia, and then after the 1905 agreement, this is the Treaty of Portsmouth that ended the Russo-Japanese War, then Japan took over southern Sakhalin. So you want to start, 1855, yeah, but you violated that agreement through an act of naked aggression. Japan had done that, and then now you sort of say, well, there was an 1855 agreement, yeah, but you violated that. You got a new agreement in 1905. The 1905 agreement was canceled by the 1945 Yalta Agreement. So you want to pick 1855? Well, you violated that through the 1905 agreement, and then the 1905 agreement was canceled by the 1945 Yalta Agreement. And so anyway, go on a little bit more, and then it says here, this is a classic. The Soviet Union, in violation of the neutrality pact still in force between Japan and the Soviet Union, attacked Japan in August 1945. Soviet forces occupied all of the 4 northern islands from August to September the 5th, 1945. So the Soviet Union, in violation of the neutrality pact still in force between Japan and the Soviet Union, attacked Japan. So Japan is the innocent party here. All right, so that's the argument. Japan is the innocent party here. Now let's just go back again with history. Japan attacks the Soviet Union during the 1930s. Japan is defeated. And then in 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union sign a neutrality treaty. Very nice, but basically that was in April of 1941. Now, the way that agreement worked was that it was operative for 5 years, and then you would have automatic renewal unless one or other party had given notice that it had no interest in renewing that agreement. That was the agreement. 5 years, unless one or other party. So it's renewable every 5 years, unless one or other party issues a notice. They have to give a 6-month notice that they intend not to renew the neutrality treaty. Well, the Soviet Union did that. That's exactly what the Soviet Union did. The Soviet Union in April 1945 had told the Japanese that it had no intention of renewing the neutrality treaty. So they had plenty of notice. They'd been given notice. So there was no violation. There was a notice. Molotov had given notice to the Japanese saying, we will not renew the neutrality treaty. So that was April 1940. So that's 4 months before the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Now, it is a little bit much for Japan. This is a kind of a somewhat perfidious country. I mean, they launched their attack on Pearl Harbor. I mean, whatever the provocations, you can say the provocations, the United States oil blockade. But the United States oil blockade was itself in response to Japan running rampant in Asia. There's no particular reason why the United States should have tolerated indefinitely Japan, running riot in Asia, whether it was in in China or Korea or anywhere else. But anyway, so that was the oil blockade, and then Japan, of course, tried to break out of the oil blockade through its attack on Pearl Harbor. Um, Japan's not exactly an innocent party here. I mean, so so oh well, we were the Soviet Union was really treated us really mean. They were very mean to us because they broke their neutrality treaty. It wasn't a surprise. Was not a surprise, perfidious attack. It was like the little just out of the blue. As I say, April 1945, which means it was basically 4 years after the signing of this neutrality treaty. 4 years after, Molotov had told the Japanese that the Soviet Union had no intention of renewing the neutrality treaty. So the Japanese, we were wronged. We was wronged, and the Soviet Union had invaded these islands. And then here we only on the and then there was about 17,500 Japanese nationals living on the four islands in August 1945, when they were forced off their land by the invading Soviets. Today, about 5,000 remain, and they are on average 89.8 years of age. Well, that's pretty good. They must have led quite a good life if their average is pretty much around 90 years of age. But yeah, I mean, there's no question that the Soviets treated the indigenous people there, the native Japanese, the residents of those islands, brutally. That's what happens. I mean, how did the Americans deal with people who were living on islands when they wanted to build the Diego Garcia? So yeah, that's what happens. Boom, you just remove the local population and you build your military and air bases there, and the people who moved out, they don't receive any compensation. So the Americans didn't provide any compensation. Anyway, Etorofu was home to some 3,608 Japanese residents. Government organized visits allowing former islanders and their relatives to directly pay their respects on ancestral graves on all four islands was suspended in 2020 due to the COVID pandemic and so on. And they have not been resumed amid worsening bilateral relations. And then here we have again the BBC, some of the story. Japan PM says absolutely unacceptable. And it's so anyway, so and earlier in the day, Japan's foreign minister Motegi said the islands were inherently Japanese territory, both historically and under international laws. They keep repeating this. Over the years, attempts to resolve the territorial dispute have made little progress. Bilateral ties have also remained frosty. Anyway, so here then also, Wall Street Journal, Putin's visit adds to pressure on Japan. And then, and then it continues. Chinese officials have for months accused Japan of rekindling the spirit of Japanese militarism that fueled its brutal wartime conduct. And then Victor Lina, commander of the Russia's Pacific Fleet, we talked about him yesterday in the podcast. He said on Wednesday, the Japanese military political leadership has set the country on course toward open militarization. And then in a report published this month, Japan's defense ministry said Japan faces its most severe and complex set of security challenges in 80 years. And then among Russia's concerns, the report listed Chinese aggressive pursuit of its expansive maritime claims, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and North Korea's nuclear advances. And the report cited growing military cooperation between the three countries as a heightened security risk. Well, no doubt Japan worries about these things, but it doesn't help its cause by identifying itself with the United States. And then here is the Ukrainian foreign minister naturally weighs in. Putin's provocative visit to Japan's Etorofu Island demonstrates utter disrespect to Japan and represents a deliberate attempt to intimidate, escalate tensions, and normalize illegal occupation. You kind of wonder, what does any of that got to do with Ukraine? What does Ukraine care? Other than to try to provoke some conflict between Russia and Japan. However, no provocative visits can change the reality. Etorofu is part of Japan's northern territories occupied by Russia. So Ukraine weighs in on this without any basis whatsoever. No basis for this claim other than Japan. I mean, Japan says this. Doesn't make it so. We believe that Putin's visit to Etorofu also proves that Moscow only understands the language of strength. Oh, the language of strength. The aggressive Russian regime does not appreciate, respect, or reciprocate constructive steps. Ukraine's position is unwavering. Japanese. I mean, you think this is what you're concerned with in Ukraine about Japan's sovereignty over the northern territories, grounded in historical facts and international law. So it's just repeating Japan's claims. No visit, no passage of time, and no attempt to impose a fait accompli can legitimize occupation. You have to say that they frankly look completely ridiculous here in these claims because these are wartime agreements. That was international law. There was no other international law other than the wartime agreements. The borders of Ukraine, these borders of Ukraine were themselves established by the wartime agreements. Now, subsequently, given what happened in 2014 following the coup and the overthrow of the legal government of Ukraine, and then the anti-Russian policies pursued by the new coup regime, then essentially the agreements that had been signed beforehand were rendered null and void. But simply saying that these belong to Japan when there's nothing in international law that accepts Japan's claim. There's been nothing. Is there a ruling? Has the International Court of Justice made a ruling and said that these 4 islands belong to Japan? No, there hasn't been. There's been no such ruling. And as we'll see in a moment, even the Americans don't support Japan's claim. Russia uses the same imperial playbook everywhere, occupies foreign land, militarizes it, threatens its neighbors, and then tries to make the world accept the illegal as irreversible. Ukraine knows this pattern all too well. It must not succeed, whether in Europe or the Pacific. We stand in solidarity with Japan. I just find this is just so kind of funny, this tweet, and deeply value its support for Ukraine. We call on our international partners to clearly condemn Putin's provocative visit, reject any attempt to normalize Russia's occupation, further isolate the aggressor, and increase sanctions pressure. And then Latvia, well, what will the world be without Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia weighing in? Latvia stands with Japan in its concern over recent developments concerning Etorofu Island and intensified Russian military activity in the region, actions that heighten tensions, undermine regional security and stability, international law, and the peaceful resolution of disputes must be respected. Developments in Euro-Atlantic, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific theaters remind us that our security is increasingly interconnected. Can we please just have a war with Russia? Please, pretty please. Anyway, this is where it gets interesting. Here is the document. It's on the State Department website. Foreign relations of the United States. And this is the Yalta. These are the Yalta agreements. Conferences, diplomatic papers, conferences at Malta and Yalta, 1945. Agreement regarding entry of the Soviet Union into the war against Japan. This is it. This is the agreement that was signed at Yalta. And here, the leaders of the 3 great powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, have agreed that in 2 or 3 months after Germany has surrendered and the war in Europe has terminated, the Soviet Union shall enter into the war against Japan on the side of the Allies, on condition that the status quo in Outer Mongolia shall be preserved, the former rights of Russia violated by the treacherous attack of Japan in 1904, shall be restored. This is the Allied powers. This is what the Allied powers said. The former rights of Russia violated by the treacherous attack of Japan in 1904. That was it. That was what provoked the Russo-Japanese War. Shall be restored. And then A, the southern part of Sakhalin, as well as the islands adjacent to it, shall be returned to the Soviet Union. The commercial port of Dairen, which is Port Arthur, shall be internationalized, the preeminent interests of the Soviet Union in this port being safeguarded, and the lease of Port Arthur as a naval base of the USSR restored. That never happened, by the way. That never really happened. In fact, the Soviet Union withdrew from Port Arthur in the 1950s. The Chinese Eastern Railroad and the South Manchurian Railroad, which provides an outlet to Dairen, shall be jointly operated by the establishment of a joint Soviet-Chinese company, it being understood that the preeminent interests of the Soviet Union shall be safeguarded and that China shall retain full sovereignty in Manchuria. And then there it is. The Kuril Islands shall be handed over to the Soviet Union. Let's read that again. The Kuril Islands shall be handed over to the Soviet Union. It is understood that the agreement concerning Outer Mongolia and the ports and railroads referred to above will require concurrence of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The President will take measures in order to obtain this concurrence on advice from Marshal Stalin. And then here we are. These are the heads of the three powers, and the signature: Stalin, Roosevelt, Churchill, February 1945. All right, so that's one document. And then here's another document. This is just since we had the whole thing about how, well, where are the documents? What are the the document? Well, there's a document. There it is. That was the Yalta Agreement. And now here's the second document, which is the Treaty of San Francisco. And here we have, whereas the Allied powers and Japan are resolved that henceforth their relations shall be those of nations which, as sovereign equals, cooperate in friendly association to promote the common welfare and maintain international peace. So this is they conclude a treaty of peace. And here we are, the state of war between Japan and each of the Allied powers is terminated. That's A. B. The Allied powers recognize the full sovereignty of the Japanese people over Japan and its territorial waters. And then Article 2, Japan, recognizing the independence of Korea, renounces all right, title, and claim to Korea, including the islands of Qualpart, Port Hamilton, and Daglatet. Japan renounces all right, title, and claim to Formosa and the Pescadores. C. Japan renounces all right, title, and claim to the Kuril Islands. Let's read that again. Treaty of San Francisco, 1951. Japan renounces all right, title, and claim to the Kuril Islands and to that portion of Sakhalin and the islands adjacent to it, over which Japan acquired sovereignty as a consequence of the Treaty of Portsmouth of September the 5th, 1905. Japan renounces all right, title, and claim in connection with the League of Nations mandate system and accepts the actions of the UN Security Council, extending trusteeship to the Pacific Islands, and so on. And then here, and this is kind of an interesting one, because As I said, the Japanese um, then claimed that somehow these four islands don't really belong to the Kuriles. So they say, yeah, well, because they said, well, we've renounced um, the Kuril Islands, but these four islands are not part of the Kuriles, so we haven't renounced our claims to them. And so this is the Americans are trying to address this particular issue of these islands. These are the legal, these are the legal brains of the U.S. State Department. So, memorandum by the Assistant Legal Advisor for Political Affairs, this is 1949. And then and it says they're trying to address this issue of the Southern Kuril Islands and requesting a study of the legal aspects of the Japanese claim to the retention of, these are the four islands, Etorofu, Kunashiri, Habomai, and Shikotan. So these are the four that we've been talking about. And then it says the basis of the Soviet claim to these islands is a passage in the Yalta Agreement, which we just looked at, between the leaders of the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. And so then they read out that says, while there are numerous historical, ethnographic, political, and economic and strategic reasons for Japanese retention of all the islands above named, the only legal question involved is the definition of the words Kuril Islands, as used in the Yalta agreements. Since all these islands were without question part of Japan before the war, they should be retained by Japan unless they are part of the Kuril Islands within the meaning of the Yalta Agreement. Okay, so the question is what belongs to the Kuril Islands, which were promised to the Soviet Union. And then it is believed that there is a sound legal basis. There is a sound basis for the legal contention that the Habomai and Shikotan are not properly part of the Kuril Islands. And then I think it's not seasons follow, reasons follow. There's a geographic, the group of 6 chief islands, although sometimes called the Lesser Kurils, is also known as the Shikotan Archipelago, and the 5 smaller islands as the Habomai group or the so on. It runs parallel to the Kuril chain, it's 35 to 40 miles distance from there. The Kurils are a string of volcanic islands which are rising from the sea. The Shikotan archipelago is geologically older and constitutes an extension of the New World. So they, we don't have to go through all the details here. And then historical, while Russia has at one time or another claimed or possessed most of the Kurils, including Etorofu, it has never before claimed any part of the Shikotan archipelago. Early Russian explorers or settlers apparently erected markers on Etorofu, which Japanese threw down in 1800 when they made settlement on the island. From that time on, Russian expeditions continued their research from the north only as far as Urupu. After a near century of dispute over Etorofu, in the Russo-Japanese Treaty of Amity in 1855, the frontier between Russia and Japan was drawn between Etorofu and Urupu. Etorofu was to belong to Japan, and Urupu as well to the Kuril Islands, situated in the north of the island. Those were the northern Kurils. And then in the St. Petersburg Treaty of 1875, in exchange for all Japanese claims to Sakhalin, the Emperor of Russia ceded to the Emperor of Japan the group of islands called Kuriles, which he possesses actually together with all the rights of sovereignty and so on. And so that was after the 1875 Treaty of St. Petersburg, and then, as I said, it was an exchange. The Japanese take all of the Kuril Islands, and then Russia takes the whole of Sakhalin. But as it happened, then the Japanese kept the Kurils, and then after the 1904-05 war, the Japanese then took over southern Sakhalin. So here we have. And anyway, so this is Shikotan. Then the Habormai Islands were never included politically in the Kuril Islands, but since 1915 have been administered by the Japanese as part of the Habormai village. So trying without getting too bogged down in these details, what this State Department is getting at that two of the four islands, which is this Habomai and Shikotan, are not part of the Kuriles, and so Japan has a claim on them. But the others, Etorofu and Kunashiri, are part of the Kuriles, and therefore Japan doesn't have a claim on them because Japan has renounced its claims on the Kuriles. And then, here it is, and there's the kicker. What the State Department legal brain says: there seems to be no sound legal reason for claiming that Kunashiri and Etorofu are not part of the Kuril Islands. So basically saying we don't accept the Japanese claim. There's no sound legal for claiming that Kunashiri and Etorofu are not part of the Kuril Islands. While as indicated above, they have never been under Russian sovereignty since the Treaty of 1855. Both that treaty and the Treaty of 1875 indicate that they were considered to be part of the Kuril Islands. That's an important point. That those agreements had stipulated that these two, the Kunashiri and Etorofu was where Putin was yesterday. Etorofu were part of the Kuril Islands and were part of the islands and were part of those islands that Japan has renounced, and then so on. And then anyway, then it continues about this, and then we have another one also along the same lines from the State Department legal document, and then okay, here. The United States cannot consistently take the position that Japan has not renounced the Kuriles any more than she can take the position that she has not renounced Formosa and the Pescadores. So basically, we cannot take the position that Japan has not renounced the Kuriles. Of course, Japan has renounced the Kuriles. She must, in view of the positions taken by the Secretary and by the U.S. Senate, contend that their disposition is for future international action. It would be perfectly consistent for the United States to support Japan in the argument that these islands or part of them should be returned to Japan. So basically, even he is supposed to accept that Japan's claims here are pretty flimsy, and then but the United States is entirely free to support Japan's claim about the Habomai and Shikotan. We're not a part of the Kuril Islands. And this is the declaration between the Soviet Union and Japan, which is what we've been talking about in 1956, in the spirit of the sort of goodwill that the Soviet Union displayed to the rest of the world in the immediate aftermath of the death of Stalin. So it seemed like, well, we'll work out some a peace treaty between the Soviet Union and Japan, and as part of that agreement, we will return these two islands, the ones that the Americans actually seem to think were not a part of the Kuriles, and therefore Japan has a legitimate claim to them. And that is Habomai and Shikotan. And then here is the joint declaration, October 1956. And again, the usual stuff, state of war between Japan shall cease on the day, and then the USSR and Japan affirm in their relations with each other they will be guided by the UN Charter, so on and so forth. And then the USSR will support Japan's application for membership of the UN. And then it says the USSR renounces all reparations claimed against Japan. USSR and Japan agreed to renounce all claims by either state, and so on. and then here about the deep sea fishing, and here finally is the key paragraph, which is the USSR and Japan agree to continue after the restoration of normal diplomatic relations between um, the USSR and Japan, negotiations for the conclusion of a peace treaty. In this connection, the USSR, desiring to meet the wishes of Japan and taking into consideration the interests of the Japanese state, agrees to transfer to Japan the Habomai Islands and the island of Shikotan. The actual transfer of these islands to Japan to take place after the conclusion of a peace treaty between the USSR and Japan. So that everything hinged on the signing of a peace treaty. Well, there was no signing of it. There was no peace treaty, and that was just two of those islands. There's nothing in any of that joint declaration whereby the USSR accepted the position of Japan, and apparently some State Department officials that Habomai and Shikotan are do not belong to the Kuriles Island chain. So the USSR has never accepted that argument. But they said we were in the spirit of goodwill. Once the peace treaty is signed, we will return these two islands, but we get to keep Etorofu and Kunashiri, and of course all of the northern Kuril Islands. So what this really means is that, I mean, despite all the bluster, Japan's claim is, there's nothing to it. I mean, it's a very, they can talk about international law all they want, then because you then have to ask what law is it that, Japan can invoke in order to make its claim. It doesn't. It's essentially counting on hostility, kind of global hostility to Russia, in which you can see how Ukraine and Latvia, this is Russia's occupying somebody else's territory, and so on and so forth. It's there's no no basis for that. It's clearly the legal arguments are on the side of Russia. Legal arguments are on the side of the Soviet Union, and of course, its successor state. Anyway, so that's that. I mean, Japan is blustering away, and then I want to just briefly touch on the latest developments in Hungary. If you recall, we had this new regime, the Magyar Péter regime, desperately seeking to oust the legally appointed president of Hungary, and this is Tamás Sukhoi, and he was unable to do it because Sukhoi hadn't done anything wrong, and so they had to find some way to get rid of him. So they couldn't just impeach him, because if you could only impeach someone if he's violated his oath of office, committed some crime or whatever. I mean, Sukhoi hadn't done anything wrong. So they passed this. They have an absolute majority in parliament, and they passed an amendment essentially targeting him. So he gets to be removed from office and replaced by somebody else. I mean, Magyar never really explained why the president had to be replaced. It's not a particularly important position. It's more of a ceremonial position. But nonetheless, he was desperate to get him out. And the only way he could do it was by passing this constitutional amendment, which he duly did. And then he was removed from office. And, we covered it here at the Gaggle. Now, right away, Magyar ran into a problem because, you oust the legally appointed president, you have to find someone to replace him with. And so he started floundering around for a replacement, and then he settled on Judith Polgar, who is the kind of a great chess player. Now, Polgar saw that this was going to be a very divisive appointment. A lot of people are going to be very angry because they were angry about the ouster of a legally appointed president, and then if she would be the replacement of somebody who had been illegally tossed out of office. So she refused to play Magyar's game and said no. So then Magyar continued to seek a president, and now he's found a replacement who is a former president of the Hungarian Supreme Court, so András Bokar. And of course, Magyar grandly, introduces him. And so, the former president of the Hungarian Supreme Court, and he will be the interim president. We don't know if he is interim or how long, but he will be the president. Very pleased with himself, as a former president of the Supreme Court. Naturally, the media, president of the Supreme Court, he must be a really distinguished figure. You don't get to be president of the Supreme Court unless you're a really distinguished man. Forgetting, of course, that András Sukhoi, the former not András, Tamás Sukhoi, the former president, the one who was ousted by Magyar, had himself been a lawyer and the president of the Constitutional Court. But as far as the media were concerned, well, he's just an Obama flack. Whereas who's president is the president of the Supreme Court, or the president of the Supreme Court. So sometimes we're supposed to be very impressed by being the president of the Supreme Court, and sometimes we don't care about somebody being the president of a constitutional court. But either way, Magyar very grandly announced him, and he was indeed voted into office. But right away, there were a couple of problems that emerged with this new president. One of which was that he really had never served as a judge in Hungary. He had basically been, he's just one of these European, flacks. He had spent all of his time on the European Court of Human Rights. So he was on the, spent years and years and years on the European Court of Human Rights. And so he hadn't really worked as a judge in Hungary. Now, there was a problem about that, because a case that was brought up before the European Court of Human Rights was a case against Hungary. Without getting into the details of all of this, it related to somebody who was convicted in Hungary as a Hungarian army officer who had killed someone during the crushing of the Hungarian uprising. So after the departure of the communist regime, this Hungarian army officer was tried for murder and crimes against humanity. He was of course convicted, as you might imagine, imprisoned. But anyway, this former, quite an elderly man by then, because that was 1956, so this happened in 2001, so he was quite an elderly man by then. Anyway, he appealed his conviction to the European Court of Human Rights, where this András Bokar sat. And the European Court of Human Rights ruled against Hungary. And they ruled against Hungary by saying that that it was invalid to convict him of crimes against humanity. So it was a complicated case, but say, well, Hungary, leave aside whether the judgment was right or wrong. They said it was wrong to convict him of crimes against humanity. You could maybe convict him of murder, but not crimes against humanity. And even then, it's even harder to say whether it was murder, because he was essentially He killed an insurrectionist. The insurrectionists had taken over a police station. The army had moved in to free the police station, and some people were killed during the retaking of the police station. But basically, the court said Hungary was wrong to convict him of crime against humanity, and this Baka, this new president of Hungary, had voted with the majority against his own country, against Hungary. You would have thought he should have recused himself, but evidently he didn't bother to recuse himself. You know, you think if it's your own country that's involved, you recuse yourself. You don't want to vote either for your country or against your country. Anyway, but he did. In 2008, he voted against his own country. Then he came back to Hungary in 2009 and became the head of the Hungarian Supreme Court. It's very strange. He had never practiced law in Hungary. He had never been a judge in Hungary, and he'd never served on the Supreme Court. But he was brought in again. It was a political operation, bringing him back. They shove him on the Supreme Court, and he's now the head of the Supreme Court. 2010. Viktor Orban wins the election. Fidesz is in power, and they don't think much of this András Baka, and they think that it's inappropriate for somebody who had not practiced being a judge in Hungary, being head of the Hungarian Supreme Court. And they said one of the conditions would be to be the head of the Hungarian Supreme Court, not just being, only applies to the head of the Hungarian Supreme Court, was you need to have served as a judge in Hungary for a minimum of 5 years. So he was removed as head of the Hungarian Supreme Court. This was around 2011. And but he wasn't removed from the Supreme Court. He could continue to serve on the Supreme Court. He just couldn't be the president of the Supreme Court. And what did this guy do, András Baka, do? The guy who's now the president of Hungary? Well, yeah, you guessed it. He sued his own country. He went to the European Court of Human Rights, where he had been a judge for many, many years. He went to them and sued his own country. And what do you know? The European Court of Human Rights, which was already moving against Hungary, particularly moving against Orban, they found in his favor and said he had been unjustly fired as president of the Hungarian Supreme Court because this was political retaliation, because he had criticized the government, because the Hungarian government had imposed age limits on judges. They said judges have to retire at the age of 70, and so the European Court of Human Rights said, oh, this was retaliation. It was punishment of this András Baka because he had spoken out against the government's policy. Now, right away, you think yourself, well, first of all, any head of the Supreme Court has no business speaking out about the government. You're supposed to be a judge, and as a judge, you don't take part in politics. You don't speak out in favor of the government. You don't speak out against the government. But he evidently didn't really take any of the normal stipulations of a judge seriously. He just spoke out against it. You remember when in the after the super PAC decision in the United States, I forgot what was it called. The name was in 2010, and which basically said there was no limit on campaign funding. Basically there would be no limits. So essentially, candidates can set up, or at least super PACs can be set up, and there would be no limits to how much they can throw into elections. But as long as the super PACs did not work with the candidates, there would still be spending limits on candidates, but not on political groups or pressure groups. There'd be no limits on spending on them. Anyway, that was the decision. Obama was obviously very opposed to it, and during his State of the Union, which I think must have been 2011, during the State of the Union, he denounced this ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court, and um, uh, one of the justices who wrote that ruling, which was Justice Samuel Alito, so while Obama during the State of the Union was denouncing the the Supreme Court ruling, Alito was listening, and then he started shaking his head, obviously indicating his disagreement with Obama's take on the Supreme Court decision. And for that, for what Alito did by shaking his head in disagreement, he came, there's a lot of, he came under a lot of attack. He said, hey, you're a judge, you're a Supreme Court justice, you have no business commenting one way or another about what politicians say. You have no business shaking your head in public, disagreeing with what the president is saying. And so he was criticized. Alito was criticized even by moderates like Jonathan Turley. Jonathan Turley said this was an inappropriate intervention into politics by a Supreme Court justice. You can disagree with Obama's take, but you can't intervene by shaking your head in disagreement with what the president is saying. But this guy, this Bokor, the new president, had decided that he disagreed with the decision of the Fidesz government to impose these age limits, and just spoke out against it. Now, whether Fidesz removed him from his position as president of the Supreme Court because he spoke out about it, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, the European Court of Human Rights found that is what he did. That essentially the Hungarian government took retaliatory measures against Bokor because of what he had said, and rather than what the government claimed, which was that you can't be president of the Supreme Court unless you've been a judge for 5 years, which again seems a very, very reasonable requirement. If you're going to be a Supreme Court judge, Citizens United is the correct answer. Thank you, Stone River. Yeah, that's it. That's the one. It was Citizens United, the name of that ruling about the no limits on campaign spending. But anyway, so that was he. So he went to the European Court of Human Rights. I think this great, horrible injustice was committed against him. He was removed as president of the Supreme Court, but he continued to serve on the Supreme Court. He was still there as a judge on the Supreme Court. He wasn't kicked out of the Supreme Court. He continued to serve. He just was no longer a president. And anyway, he went, sued his own country at the European Court of Human Rights, the very court that he himself had served, I don't know, however many years, 20 years or whatever. And he won. No surprise there. The European Court of Human Rights ruled against Orban. So there he is. So first, he rules against his own country in a case when he should have basically recused himself. Whether the decision in that case, the Kerbey case was right or not. I tend to think that the decision was correct, but anyway, we don't have to get into that now. But he, as a Hungarian, should have recused himself. So he rules against his own country there. Then, this horror is perpetrated against him. He's removed as president of the Supreme Court, but is allowed to continue to work on the Supreme Court. And then he sues his own country and wins. And the European Court of Human Rights rules in his favor, and so he is this person who is the president. But to add insult to injury, he has taken the place of someone who was illegally ousted from his position. So he had sued his own country over the horror and the indignity of being removed from office, of office that he thinks he was entitled to. That this was an illegal removal from office. He sues his own country. Then he's now been appointed president, and he's taken the place of somebody who was himself illegally thrown out of office. There's no question that the Tamás Shulyok, the president, the outgoing president, was considers that he was thrown out of his position illegally. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had no means of defending himself. He had no means of holding on to his position. There was, he had no legal redress, and he was thrown out. And apparently, this András Baka, the man who had gone to Strasbourg to sue his own country because he'd been removed from office, now apparently thinks it's perfectly okay to take the job of someone who was himself illegally removed from office. So that is the Hungary of today, and I just show you quickly the coverage, and just show, of course, the media regard him as this great legal mind. Always get ready for the coverage. He's a fine legal mind, the finest legal mind of his generation. Wait for the cliches. So here we have Hungary's parliament approves Orban critic and former judge András Baka as president. And then Hungarian lawmakers approve former Supreme Court chief András Baka as the country's new president on Tuesday, following the contested removal last month of the previous head of state as pro-EU conservative. I guess they always do this. EU conservative. He's not a conservative. There's nothing conservative about him, but they always have to say conservative Peter Magyar. There's nothing conservative about him other than he had worked his way through the Fidesz apparat. That's how he got to be into his position. He was a functionary of Fidesz. There's nothing conservative about him. So anyway, it pushes to loosen his predecessor's lingering hold over state institutions. He's got this lingering hold. So you basically appoint someone illegally. And then Parliament, where the ruling TISA party holds a 2/3 majority, elected Baka, who served 17 years as a judge on the European Court of Human Rights, with 140 in favor and 6 against. Magyar said Baka's life served as an example of commitment to the democratic rule of law and constitutional principles, as the Central European country needs to be guided back onto the path of the rule of law and constitutional government. So the rule of law is you illegally oust a legally appointed president. That's the way to the rule of law. The media, of course, just repeat all this, without a shred of self-awareness. How can this be legal? How can you get back to the rule of law when you remove a president without any legal basis whatsoever? And these we got about the rule. And then Hungary's previous president, Tamás Shulyok, saw his mandate cut short by a constitutional amendment adopted as part of a Magyar's reform push. It's not a reform, it's a coup. Magyar's party won, blah, blah, they won this election. But rights watchdogs criticized Shulyok's removal, comparing the tinkering to the methods Orban used to build his self-styled illiberal system. Orban's Fidesz party and so on boycotted the vote, arguing Shulyok's ouster was tyrannical and illegitimate, which of course it was. And then Baka has not been critical of Shulyok's removal. Of course he hasn't. He wants the job, despite the fact that he was terminated with a similar legislative act. So at least Euronews reports that, yeah, that's very strange. Baka had actually been removed, and he had sued his own country over that. And then he says, here is this man, this is the new president. In a country governed by the rule of law, such extraordinary measures cannot be used. But Hungary became a captured state under Orban, he told the AFP. So, well, illegality. No, I don't subscribe to illegality. But when you've got Orban, then I do support illegality. Well, that's right. Well, this is always the argument of every tyrant. Yeah, in general, removing freedom, that's always a bad idea. But in this case, is justifiable. So he evidently doesn't think that there's anything wrong with his taking the position of a president who had been illegally ousted. The chess champion Polgar did think there was something wrong. She said, "No, I'm not going to take part in this charade and taking the job of somebody who had been illegally ousted." But this man, oh, he's so great legal mind. He served at the European Court of Human Rights for 17 years. The man who then sued his own country to get his old job back. He didn't get his job back, but he sued to get his old job back. Thinks there's nothing wrong with taking the job of someone who has been illegally ousted. And then here we have state officials like the president were appointed not to restrain government's power, but to ensure the political survival of a former system even after electoral defeat. So again, notice how the presidency is supposed to be a non-political position. It's a ceremonial position. It's not a political position. But here he is denouncing his predecessor. Just as I said, a Supreme Court, the president of the Supreme Court, launched into an attack against the government, which is something no judge is supposed to do. State officials like the president were appointed not to restrain the government's power, but to ensure the political survival of the former system, even after electoral defeat. So here he is, absolutely sounding like a political hack, total political hack. He's actually repeating the hackery of Peter Magyar and Anita Orban and all of these TISA hacks by saying, oh, he was the stomping to Mashoya. He was a president. He was the president he essentially held a ceremonial position. There's no evidence whatever that he was doing anything political. And the evidence for that is that he raised no issues at all over swearing in the new government. And so here we have Bokar added. And then installing Bokar as president signals a guarantee that the restoration of liberal democracy will proceed along a clearly defined path. Yeah, of course, we're just going to throw out illegally anyone that we don't politically agree with, says Bulchu Zhiga from the Center for Fair Political Analysis. So the same principle whereby we just rig the system to ensure that Orban cannot run again, cannot be prime minister again. We just simply create by fiat an amendment to the Constitution, and then of course we could, by the same fiat, we say that anyone who has served more than 3 terms in Parliament cannot run again. That's it, and it just so happens that falls on the burden falls on Fidesz and Viktor Orban, but not on TISA and Peter Magyar. But this Center for Fair Political, whatever mumbo jumbo, they say, yeah, that's great, absolutely great, yeah, that's the way to remove illiberal democracy. And then here we have then it says, besides a brief stint as a lawmaker elected from the Hungarian Democratic Forum Party in 1990, but did not hold any political positions. He was a judge there. In 2009, he was nominated as the head of the Supreme Court, but was ousted in 2012 after he condemned a move under Orban to reduce the age of mandatory retirement for judges from 70 to 62, calling it a judicial purge. Notice again how the media report this, that rather than what the law stated, was that you can't be president of the Supreme Court unless you've been a judge for 5 years, which I think is, a very reasonable stipulation. But anyway, that's the news from Hungary. And now let us go to our locals page, and this is where the Gagglers they congregate. So as I always say, if you want to interact with me, if you want to ask me questions, if you want to challenge anything I say, criticize anything I say, then please join our community. It's well worth your time. The gaggle.locals.com. And then, if you join, you can post whatever comments you want. And I will attempt to address any issues that you may have. I can't, I'm not able to answer questions on YouTube because there's too many, and I cannot address all the comments. So if you want to talk to me, please join the community, thegaggle.locals.com, you won't regret it. Anyway, here is the first question. Of course, it comes from our very good friend Cynthia. Cynthia, I always say this, is our resident film scholar and film expert, and is really one of the draws of the Gaggles. You want to, if you're thinking about joining, well, this is one of the great benefits. We have regular film screenings of, I think, excellent films, and so not only do you get to see these great films here on the Gaggle Locals board, but you get to enjoy all of Cynthia's very erudite, scholarly, insightful comments. So we're always able to learn so much from Cynthia's learning and Cynthia's great expertise when it comes to the history of cinema and all the different genres of cinema and all the national cinematic traditions and everything. So we're very fortunate to have somebody like Cynthia here. So if you're thinking of joining the Gaggle, that's another draw. Obviously, big draw is that you can interact with me and with Peter, but you also get to learn a great deal about the history of cinema, filmmaking, and everything else. So courtesy of Cynthia. So thank you very much, Cynthia. Anyway, Cynthia asks, why doesn't Trump stop Zelensky from blowing up Russian oil tankers and refineries, especially when even Biden told him to stop? Trump likely doesn't care at all about the environmental damage, but surely he cares when strikes risk pushing up oil prices and hurting U.S. consumers. So why let them go on? Unless Trump and his family are personally profiting from front running the oil trade, which would be a stunning abuse of power, he should be ordering Zelensky to stop these strikes. I think it's an excellent question, and it's hard to answer any questions when they pertain to Trump, because we really don't understand why he hasn't really brought this war in Ukraine to an end when he said he would. He said he would do it on day one. We gave him a little bit of latitude. I remember soon after his inauguration, and I said, well, let's give him a little bit of time. You can't do everything in one day, but he really didn't do anything very much. So, leave aside the disastrous war with Iran that he got the United States into. The question then, why didn't he bang heads together and or put pressure on Zelensky to bring the war to an end? And when I said bang heads together, because I think Russia was ready to make some concessions. concessions that I think many of Russian supporters would not have been happy. But I think, in the sort of, I think Russia was ready um, to show goodwill towards Trump. I think Russia has always had a little bit of a soft spot for Trump, thinking that he was a kind of a pragmatic businessman, someone they could do deals with. You can see this in the tweets of Kirill Dmitriev, who never says anything negative about Trump. In fact, Putin himself never really says anything negative about Trump. So I think the Russians were willing to make concessions in the early days of the Trump administration. However, Trump didn't do that. And despite the blow up with Zelensky in February of 2025, he's more or less gone along with the NATO agenda. He hasn't really changed the Biden policy, and in fact, the various highly risky ventures that Ukraine has embarked on, the deep strikes on Russian territory, the assassination plot against Putin in December last year, the attack on Russia's strategic bomber fleet. Trump seems to have gone along with all of that. So then we say, you're right. Why doesn't he tell Zelensky to cut it out? Because the more you start hitting oil tankers and oil refineries and oil storage depots, the more problematic the global oil situation becomes. And it isn't really to Trump's advantage to have oil prices at the pump soaring, and his administration collapsing as a result. So is there a pecuniary motive here? Maybe so. He may be making some kind of money on all of this, but that has to be set against the obvious negative political consequences for him of rising oil prices. So then you have to think, well, maybe just Trump is a very weak president. He's unable to impose his will on Zelensky. Despite all of his tough talk, he's unable to get Zelensky to do what he wants him to do. And so Zelensky continues, with his destructive activities. And on the contrary, all of the newspaper reports, and we've covered them in some detail, suggest that Trump is quite excited about Ukraine's attacks deep inside Russia. He was happy by Zelensky's attacks on oil refineries. He's apparently happy about Zelensky's attacks on Wildberries, on the online retailer and all of their storage depots. So he doesn't seem to have any real guiding, any guideposts as to what he really wants to do. And so what we had assumed, at least what I had assumed early on in the administration, is he wants to end this war. He thinks this war, serves no useful purpose. It doesn't in any way help the United States, and he's going to pursue that policy. Maybe, one step forward, two steps backwards, or two steps forward and one step backwards, whatever. But he will pursue that policy because there's nothing in it for the United States. And on the contrary, it's getting United States involved in a dangerous confrontation with Russia. And since he seems to think China is the United States' main adversary, he really doesn't want to do anything that strengthens China. Therefore, he'd want to bring Russia over to America's side. So that would be the goal that he would pursue. But he hasn't done it. And in fact, all he's done is essentially pursue the Biden policy, which is just to go along with NATO, just to go on raising the costs for Russia, even though there are so many negative consequences for the world economy, for the United States, and for everyone in Europe. So, just to answer your question, Cynthia, I'd say Trump is just rather a weak leader. He hasn't been able to impose any kind of a coherent policy on the United States. He's essentially continued the Biden agenda, even though seemingly he said, at least during the campaign, he said this isn't doing us any good. It's not doing the United States any good. So unfortunately, and this is more evidence that Trump is a weak leader. Why has Trump gone along with Bibi Netanyahu's plans? Well, I think he's weak. For all his tough talk, he doesn't seem to have any vision of what the United States foreign policy should be. So it's just simply continuing. In the Ukraine case, he's just continuing the sort of the Biden policy, and in the Iran case, he's just continuing with the Israel policy. None of that has anything to do with America First or Make America Great Again or any of the rest. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Robert says the Iran war has exposed something Hollywood often obscures. War is discontinuous and non-teleological. Films portray a steady tempo of combat driving toward victory. But was World War II really like that? In retrospect, it looks inevitable, but in its actual tempo, was it also full of pauses, reversals, uncertain objectives, stalled fronts, failed offensives, and long periods when nobody knew what came next? Well, that's a very interesting issue. It's hard to know because if you sort of let's say you look back, you're absolutely right. When we look back on World War II, it seems very much like, oh well, 1943, February 1943. Germany's defeated at Stalingrad. Now the end of the war is inevitable, and we're just going to keep, inexorably marching on to victory over Hitler. But in many ways, it wasn't really that obvious because the even all the way up to say 1944, the winter 44-45, the expectation among the Allied powers was that the war was going to continue for some years further. Nobody really thought that Germany was really on its last leg. Germany was on the brink of collapse. In fact, the Allied powers believed that Germany would be able to withdraw its forces and, replenish its defenses at home, and would be an extremely tough nut to crack. I mean, trying to invade Germany would be just almost an impossible task. So the Allied powers believed that the war would continue for some years further because, Germany has had to withdraw, but so what? You can withdraw and consolidate your defenses at home. And then I suppose the question is why didn't Germany do that? And that that is a sort of interesting issue. I think a more intelligent, a more strategically shrewd leadership in Germany would have just done that. Following the defeat at Stalingrad, they would have withdrawn their forces, certainly from the Soviet Union, and set up lines that were defensible. And then, just challenge the Allied powers. Okay, well, come and invade us. see how you fare. So so I think a different strategy could have prolonged the war for some years further. And I think much the same was said about the Great War in World War I. Had Ludendorff not launched his Easter offensive in 1918, Germany could have just simply waited the Allies out. Germany could have continued with that war. It was the folly of launching that Easter offensive and Germany extending its lines unnecessarily, and then essentially having its forces, crushed by the Allied counteroffensives that led to the German collapse in November 1918. A different strategy, again, just dig in, don't mount any offensives, and establish strong defensive lines. The war could have continued. There was absolutely no reason why Germany would have collapsed in November 1918. So I do think that wars can absolutely go on. We could have forever wars. We could have had forever wars in both of the world wars. It was somehow Germany's absolutism, the desperate need to well, in the case of World War I, to pull off some great victory. But in the case of Hitler, um, I tend to think that he felt that if he were to consolidate, to withdraw his forces and consolidate and create um, strong defensive lines and prevent an Allied onslaught on Germany, he felt that he would have been overthrown, and that might have happened. So with Hitler, it was really his political survival, I think, depended on his continuing to mount offensives and trying to win a war rather than establish strong defensive lines. So yeah, I mean, I would think it's teleological, as you say, because you say, oh yeah, from Stalingrad on, the defeat of the Wehrmacht was inevitable. I'm not sure. I'm not at all sure, because I mean, how much of Europe continued to be under German occupation long after Stalingrad? So it was, by no means obvious then that somehow, German defeat was a piece of cake. It really wasn't. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. And Robert says, not sure if it's me, but or locals, but I'm unable to buy any tip jar coins. Well, that's depressing. Um, I hope you can rectify that. Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Anne Marie. Again, Anne Marie, like Cynthia, is one of the big draws of the gaggle. If you like cinema, join the gaggle. This is where you get your film knowledge and your film history. And if you like classical music, if you want to learn more about classical music, learn about the playing of classical music, learn about the performance of classical music, learn about all the intricacies of composition and playing and conducting, all of that, you come to the gaggle, and come particularly for the expertise of Anne Marie, who is, of course, herself an internationally renowned violinist, a very, very distinguished musician, who performs with some of the finest orchestras in the world. Throughout the European continent, has been doing it in the 20th and 21st centuries, and is an extraordinary authority on classical music. So he knows a great deal about just about every piece of music written, and knows about about the classical composers. And so we at the Gaggle, we Gagglers, get to enjoy learning so much from Anne Marie. We get to enjoy her expertise and her always insightful descriptions of classical music, and above all, her very interesting and amusing accounts of the difficulties involved in playing music at the highest level. So what it's like to play difficult, long, difficult pieces in very difficult and challenging physical circumstances, which I've always been fascinated by, because orchestras, when you watch them, you think, wow, that is uncomfortable. There's uncomfortable chairs, and this is a long, difficult piece. So you know, we always get to learn so much about every aspect of classical music. So thank you so much, Anne Marie, for all of your contributions. And here's Marty. Marty, here's a new picture, and yeah, so this is a picture of well, it's obviously Berlin, but where what is the date is yeah, I don't know. I guess my guess would be that this is preparations in Berlin for an upcoming invasion. Um, or let's see. No, no, let me try and figure this out. Or is this? So this may be no. This no. I think what this is that it wasn't about the invasion. I think this is preliminary to the building of the Berlin Wall in Berlin. So this was during the Berlin crises, and this was they set up these barriers to prevent East Germans from leaving for West Germany through Berlin, which of course had been divided, and so you had the zones of occupations, the three zones of occupation, the three Western powers consolidated into the western part of Berlin, but East Germans were able to leave East Germany through the Berlin Wall. But before the building of the Berlin Wall, there were indeed these kind of makeshift barbed wire sandbags kind of constructions. So I think that's what I would say. This is the preliminary to the building of the Berlin Wall. That would be my guess. Looks kind of grim. It was quite a grim wall. Anyway, thank you so much, Marty. And here we have Stone River says Citizens United. Thank you. Then George, have you followed the Sangita Mishka case? Sangita Mishka case. I have to say I haven't followed that. Let me write that down. Sangita Mishka. It's I can't always get on top of things, but I will look this up. I'm sure this is here we go. Sangita Mishka. So that I will look this up, and Mishka, and I will get back to it on by Tuesday. It's my shortcoming that I'm sure if Stone River brings it up, that it's an interesting case. So I will look this up, and I promise I will address it at on the Tuesday live stream. So thank you for that, and then here's Robert with. Oh God, von der Leyen and President Trump tariff talks. Says we may come from different continents, but we clearly get our foreign policy from the same salon. And of course, the joke is the salon, the hair salon. Yeah, they kind of look. Yes, they look alike. Yeah, God, von der Leyen. Yeah. Yes, that was very good. Thank you for that. We may get from this. We get foreign policy from the same salon. All right. Thank you so much for that. And I think, my time is up. Thank you, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all your questions and comments. And I'm going to look up the Sangita Mishka case and, weigh in on that next Tuesday. Thank you, Stone River, for that. Anyway, we'll have some more podcasts over the weekend. And then next Monday, we're going to do the joint live stream with Peter. And then on Tuesday, I'll be back for my solo. I look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, all the best. Good night.